As housing in Boston and many other cities becomes less affordable, longtime residents feel increasingly squeezed. Despite the growing supply of housing, there's also growth in demand, especially from college students. That's why the long-range housing plan last year from Mayor Walsh called for a report on student housing. To tell us about the report is our guest from the Department of Neighborhood Development, Devin Quirk. Thank you very much for being with us, Devin.
Glad to be back, Chris.
First of all, start with some of what looks like an encouraging sign over the past year or so. What's going on out there?
So, I think one of the first things to report on is Mayor Walsh's goals. So he has two very clear goals around student housing. One is making sure that all students are safe in the housing that they're in, and then two is making sure that students we're mitigating the impacts that students have on their neighborhoods. And one of the best ways we can do that is by helping move students into dormitories and managed student housing. There's about 150,000 students living in Boston, or actually going to school in Boston. About 35 to 40,000 of them are living off campus in Boston. So that's a pretty big impact on Boston's neighborhoods. But there is good news to report, and to your point, Chris. There's been a decrease in the number of students living off campus in Boston and off campus in the greater Boston rental housing market, in fact. So we looked at the numbers, and we actually found that there was about 1,800 less students living in the greater Boston housing market off campus than there was last year. So that's a 4% decrease, and I think that's something that is lessening the burden on our neighborhoods.
And that number is only a little bit greater than the new supply of dorms.
Yeah.
So is that the reason, I guess?
I think that's a big part of it. Yeah, there was about 1,400 new dorm beds that came online last year, and that's a really big number in 1 year. Just to give you some sense of scope, there was only about 1,300 in the past 3 years prior to that combined. So I think that's a big driving force in why students are leaving rental housing neighborhoods, because there's new dorms that they can move into, and those are attractive new places for them to live.
So how is the city going to get colleges to build more dorms? Because if you look at the mayor's long-range plan, he's talking about something about 18,000 beds.
Yeah.
Colleges, they don't want to give away too much of their precious campus territory for dorms. So how do you get to 18,000?
Yeah, so our goal is 18,500 beds by 2030. So we've got some time to get there, and the good news is that some of it's already underway. We built 1,400 last year. We've got another 4,000 already in the pipeline. About 900 of those are going to be completed very soon. Another 1,000 probably in the next 2 years. But you're right, there's still a ways to go. About half of that goal we still haven't, we don't have specific sites for. So it's one strategy is meeting with our colleges and universities and talking to them about the mayor's priority around student housing and building more housing on campus. But we're also sympathetic to your point that it can't all be university-backed capital to build these dorms, particularly not in the time frame we want to build them. So if we want to accelerate the pace of dormitory construction in Boston, one of the things we can do is look to the private market and see if there's private student housing developers who are interested in building housing in Boston. Now, there's certainly some concerns about that. We want to make sure that student housing that's privately developed or privately managed is safe, it's well supervised, and it's at sites that are really acceptable to the community. So we're talking with private developers now, we're talking with schools, and we're trying to find that first test case to bring a privatized student dorm to Boston that would be acceptable to the community and have a community conversation in a particular neighborhood about what that dorm should look like and how that management structure should work.
Well, the advantages here is it's new housing, so you're not taking more out of the rest of the housing market for students. And at the same time, I can imagine some people in the neighborhood saying, well, wait a minute, why have that available space used for students when there are other people who need the housing too?
We need a lot of housing in Boston. In fact, we need 53,000 units of housing by 2030. That's the mayor's goal. And we want to make most of that housing is either affordable housing or workforce housing. Our goal is to build 18,500 beds, dorm beds for students, and by doing so, free up 5,000 units of workforce housing. So only 5,000 of the 53,000 units in the mayor's plan are coming from student dormitory creation. So the emphasis, appropriately so, needs to be on housing affordability for all people in Boston, including Boston's workforce and low-income population.
Well, I know if you take the students out of that part of the housing market, you're still going to have some other kinds of demand, but how do you get to those 5,000 for workforce? Because that's a fairly strong kind of affordability you're talking about. So how do you lock that in?
So the idea is that as students move into student dormitories, that frees up that workforce housing for Boston's workforce. One stat that we share a lot is that there's 14,000 students living in 1 to 3 family homes or condos in Boston. That's housing that was originally built for Boston's workforce. It's larger family-oriented housing in many cases, triple deckers and that type of housing. So we're really looking for policies that would move students into a more student-specific housing scenario where they get supervision and all the amenities that they want, and then we open up that larger housing stock for Boston's families as it was originally intended.
Right. Talk about the safety in the housing. I know this is mainly done by inspectional services, but yeah. I guess there is a bit of a phasing in that's involved here.
So Commissioner William Christopher, our Commissioner of Inspectional Services, is taking student housing very seriously. As I said, the mayor's first goal around student housing is to make sure students are safe. So one of the things that the Inspectional Services Department has done is they've done an analysis of the data, the same data we use to generate our report, and look for instances of overcrowding or areas where there might be an unsafe number of students living in one unit of housing, and then to proactively reach out to those students and also the school, send them a letter to let them know that that there might be an unsafe scenario and they'd like to do an inspection. And so they're actively doing those inspections now. And one of the great accomplishments of last year is we've been able to work with all the universities to get address level specific data. So this is a level of intervention we haven't been able to do before, to be able to actually know where most students are actually living in Boston when they're living off campus, and we can connect with them and find those instances of overcrowding.
Right. As far as the things that prompted this, and this is going back to before Mayor Walsh took office, is that we had some very scary scenarios, especially in the Allston area.
Yeah, yeah. So like I said, Mayor Walsh's #1 priority is student safety, and that's something that as we're writing this report, we're taking very seriously. But we think that one of the best long-term solutions to ensuring student safety is to create more dormitories. So that's why another reason why we have this emphasis on dormitory creation.
Talk about the recently opened dormitory near Northeastern that was developed. There was a private involvement here?
Yeah, so there are, like I mentioned, one of our strategies is to explore private dormitories as a model for housing in Boston. And if you think about what a dormitory looks like, there are really 2 variables that we think are really important. Where is it? Is it on campus or off campus? And who manages it? Is it managed by the university or is it managed by a private operator? In history in Boston, almost all of our dorms are on-campus, university-managed dorms. Northeastern's dormitory that they opened on the Grand Mark, it's called, is a off-campus, university-managed dorm. So it's privately owned, but it's university operated. So we also want to look at other models as well, things that are perhaps on campus, but operated or owned by a private entity, so they get private capital involved in the building of dormitories on campus. I know some universities are interested in that model. And the other model is a totally off-campus, privately operated dormitory. There's a lot of success in doing that type of dormitories in other cities. Chicago has a lot of these dormitories at scale. But we want to make sure that that model would actually work in Boston. So we're having conversations with the community about what they'd like to see.
And briefly, I guess one of the advantages of this private option here is that the units are more likely to get built. Why is that?
Well, it's where the money's coming from, right? So we bring in private capital to help accelerate the pace of dormitory construction. We can build a lot more dormitories more quickly than we could otherwise do if only university capital was involved in building those dorms.
Thank you very much for being with us.
I'm glad to be here, Chris.
Devin Quirk from the Department of Neighborhood Development. Still to come, a public history project on Columbia Point. But first, this message.